Hi guys, in this video I want to share my opinion on the recent political events as a Russian. I want to comment on the Putin Trump summit, what Russian journalists said about their trip to Alaska, and how they ambiguously hinted that, it's actually Russian. Also, we'll learn about the new method of censorship, banning WhatsApp calls, a new state messenger, and so on. And I want to respond to a certain opinion shared by some bloggers that all Russians are imperialists, and even those who oppose the war and left the country, like myself, are just Amazon refugees. Okay, so let's start. The first thing that astonished probably the whole world was the moment when the American soldiers rolled out the red carpet for Putin. They literally had to bow down to a real murderer who bombs civilians every day. I don't even understand how Trump let this happen. Didn't he think in advance? Didn't his advisors tell him that it's not going to look good? Okay, and what Russian media tells us about this all? They are just celebrating this happy day. Our strong leader Vladimir Putin set foot on the American soil. They count our opinion. We are playing in the big politics again. And in fact, some of these journalists traveled to the United States together with Putin, and they also shared how they were placed there. Alaska welcomed us with its characteristic hospitality. For a long time, we could not get off the plane and go to our almost native land. Alaska painfully reminds us not only of Kamchatka, but even of Yaroslavl region. Then you ride the same bus through Anchorage and realize that you don't really feel any regrets about the historical loss, as in other cases. It looks so much like Russia, but it's not Russia, and thank God.
Штат с российскими корнями, потому что Аляска в свое время была частью Российской империи.
This journalist ironically tells how he is going to a supermarket to check whether Russian bank cards work in the USA. So I went into the store, put my salary card in, and no, it doesn't work, sir. It's probably because the Mir cards don't work. I take out my old MasterCard left over from the pre-SMO times, but the card is not supported, so no sanctions were lifted from us. Also, the reporter shares how their delegation was met by protesters. The peace of the Alaska residents was disturbed by hundreds of Ukrainians, Americans, and Canadians with flags and posters. They don't want peace. They demand that negotiations not be held. A local blogger who came to the rally posted on his social media, "Ukraine supporters are pushing war, not peace." And he is absolutely right, because the Ukrainian issue will be one of the main ones, and both leaders want to solve it. But the yellow-blue side is not interested in this. Meanwhile, there was less and less time left before the meeting. That meant it was time to get up and brush my teeth, although there was a long line here.
Здесь спартанские условия.
Давайте протестируем кровать, чтобы вы понимали, насколько она мягкая, если вообще-то можно назвать кроватью. Я думаю, по звуку понятно. Разместили нас в местном стадионе.
В душе нет двери, поэтому я прикатила вот такую доску и закрыла вход, потому что здесь вот так все открыто.
In Russia we have this stereotypical image of a demanding tourist who travels to Egypt or Turkey, affordable holiday destinations, and starts to evaluate the conditions of the suite, the food, getting drunk and being rude to other vacationers.
А мы ее оба! Тагил рулит! Ну, Вован,
Of course, these are stage shots from the sketch show Nasha Russia, where they parodied such ignorant tourists. But for me, honestly, the people who work for Putin's regime look just as pathetic. Foreign Minister Lavrov even came in a sweater with the USSR print, just like the tourist from the show. At the same time, it seemed to me that the way state media is covering this summit looks like they feel inferior to Americans. They know that the US is stronger and richer than Russia, so they talk negatively about America to save face, but the moment there is a chance to get closer to it, they suddenly turn servile. Remember when Tucker Carlson visited Moscow? How they followed his each step. Tucker Carlson bought bread in a supermarket. Tucker Carlson said Moscow is a very beautiful city, as if they see every American citizen as a Hollywood superstar. Because authoritarian Putinism has trained them to flatter superiors for their own gain. So it's funny how they have to switch between different opinions. Because yesterday the United States were our main enemy together with Europe. They wanted to make our country weaker. But today, actually, America is our friend, and it's only Europe who now wants to destroy our country.
И нам, конечно, на данном этапе тактически очень важно, чтобы тема санкций вообще ушла в сторону, но ключевым является выработка, в том числе и с Америкой, но не только с Америкой, тех новых инструментов, которые лягут в основу, видимо, миропорядка.
So yeah, the Kremlin doesn't give Russian propaganda journalists a break, sending them different guidelines on what they have to say on each day.
Maybe you can make change to the world, reaching out for your soul.
Another hilarious thing was when Putin told Trump that American elections were rigged because the US is voting via snail mail, given that in Russia they literally placed voting stations on stumps. And I mean, the dictator who has been in power for 30 years is the last person who can talk about honest and transparent elections. Take even the moment when Putin and Trump were walking along this red carpet and a journalist clearly shouted,
"Putin, will you stop killing civilians?"
And he made this gesture. What? I don't hear anything. He's just laughing at everyone's faces.
So many of you saw this question I asked Russian President Vladimir Putin.
My question is, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of? You didn't answer my question, sir. If all of your political opponents are dead, in prison, poisoned, doesn't that send a message that you do not want a fair political fight?
Well, 4 years later, I found myself in the same room as him once again. He didn't hold a press conference this time where he took any questions, and so here's what I shouted.
Mr. Putin, will you agree to a ceasefire? Mr. Putin, will you commit to not killing any more civilians?
And the reason why I shouted that question is because the violence continues. She was just 18 months old. She was killed by Russia. 5 attack drones hitting her home, and she was sleeping at the time. As I made my way back home to Washington, D.C., I heard from so many of you, so many people in Ukraine, sharing your personal stories. Where does all of this stand now? That summit ended with no ceasefire and no consequences for Russia.
Also, I want to comment on that unusual gesture that Putin made when he answered something to this journalist, apparently. It is indeed weird to see Putin making such funny facial expressions, but at the same time, it's also normal, because he often says jokes to be closer to the people, and honestly, he is successful in it, and he can fool other people, and that's what he did to the American president. Because, oh my god, that whole reception in Alaska looked as a date where Trump was trying to court Putin.
But I thought it was a nice picture of him. Okay of me, but nice of him.
I think he wants to make a deal with me.
But I understood why this is happening actually after watching videos by Vlad Vexler. He is a political philosopher, he also knows Russian and he understands the Russian politics. So Vlad explains Trump's actions by his narcissism, and he uses this term narcissistic supply. So for Trump, Vladimir Putin is his source of the narcissistic supply. Being around Putin makes him feel better about himself, because Trump feels that Putin is like a very great man, an important historical figure. That's why all the time the American president mentions how Putin praised him for these words, or that Putin respects him. But the KGB school taught Putin pretty well, and he knows how to fool Trump. And here I want to remind you of the prophetic words of Kamala Harris said during the debate exactly 1 year ago.
How quickly you would give up for the sake of favor and what you think is a friendship with what is known to be a dictator who would eat you for lunch.
And as a result, Putin achieved what he wanted. He showed his elites that they still need him because he can negotiate with Trump and maybe lift some of these sanctions so that Putin's oligarchs will be able to travel to Europe with their wives or mistresses and buy Gucci purses for them again. So the Russian president came out a winner in this situation. But already for so many times it was proved that Putin, he will not stop. He wants to have the whole of Ukraine. He sees this country as just another region of Russia, and he sees himself as a great collector of lands, like Peter the Great. And we saw this when he lectured Tucker Carlson about Prince Rurik, saying all these vague speeches about geopolitics and history. And this continued at this pseudo press conference where American journalists were not allowed to ask a single question. And even the Fox News reporter, who has to be loyal to Trump, criticized it.
It did not seem like things went well, and it seemed like Putin came in and steamrolled, got right into what he wanted to say, and got his photo next to the president and then left.
And here I was watching it and laughing sardonically, and whereas the US reporters were surprised, for me, seeing this was so normal. I was like, yeah, this is Putin. This is how he deals with journalists and uncomfortable questions, given that when he has his annual press conferences, there are only loyal journalists and all the questions are prepared in advance. And this quote-unquote press conference perfectly demonstrates the state of free speech and freedom of press in Russia. I've just watched a video where Michael McFaul, a former US ambassador to Russia, is interviewed by the Russian opposition media TV Rain. But there is something that was strange to hear from a person that has to know so much about Russia. So when the journalist said, probably Ukrainians are already tired of this war, suddenly Michael McFaul got very emotional and he said, you know, we are constantly talking about Ukrainians being tired of this war, but what about Russians? When are Russians going to get tired of this war?
Well, first, we always talk about how the
The Russians lose their sons in this war as well. When will they get tired of it? But we must understand that in Russia, unfortunately, the value of human life is low. People who mainly lose their men in this war are poor people from distant regions who do not know their rights, and they cannot achieve bringing their mobilized men back home. And people in big cities who were not affected by this just continue living their lives. And when a journalist tried to remind McFaul about this situation, with all the censorship and repressions, he said, okay, but what about those Russians who left the country? Why aren't they protesting now?
Те, кто живет за границей, они прямо сейчас, прямо сегодня должны выходить на акции протеста и протестовать против этой варварской войны.
I'm like, can you just leave me alone? For these 3 years that I've lived in Georgia, I went to protest. There were big protests, and there are all over the world. There are organizations and activists who try to do something.
Тоже со своей стороны нужно пойти на какие-то уступки. Пусть Путин пойдет со своей стороны на компромисс. Пусть он перестанет губить собственное население.
Вы говорите о справедливости. Конечно, Путин должен пойти на компромисс, но он не идет на компромисс. Президент вашей страны, Майкл, не толкает Путина к компромиссу и никак не помогает вообще ситуации для того, чтобы она завершилась справедливым миром. К сожалению, мы находимся в реальности.
So these words by the diplomat felt like another accusation against Russian people that they cannot stop Putin. In this situation where it is Trump who is so easily played by Putin, it is Trump who can push Putin into compromises, who really can stop this war, not me going tomorrow at the protest here in Tbilisi. Of course it is important, but it's been 3 years. Maybe you should stop making scapegoats of us, Russians living abroad, and those anti-war Russians inside the country who cannot say or do anything.
I don't think the majority of Russians, everyday Russians, care. They didn't care in 2014 and they knew what was happening. They didn't care in 2022. The only Russian refugees that fled the country were Amazon refugees, is what I call them. These are people who didn't care what they did in Georgia, Syria, the Middle East and Crimea and Ukraine. But as soon as sanctions started coming in and they couldn't order McDonald's to their house, they couldn't get their Amazon packages, then it's a step too far. Then they decided to flee Russia.
Okay, I will just read what Roman Akers posted on his Insta story about this blogger. Remember this British ex-right-wing grifter who is on a pro-Ukraine grift right now? Of course, he's fucking going on a tirade about how all Russians, even those who oppose the war and left the country and sacrifice everything, are only doing it because they're Amazon refugees. Sorry, I couldn't do anything about Georgia at the age of 10. Not everyone is a privileged white British cunt grifter. I agree. Russians didn't care in 2014 and you did? No, you were making videos on how Muslims are bad. Well, what I can say, just rage bait and lies as well, because he said Navalny supported invasion of Ukraine and all the Russian oppositionists are imperialists. I think that this guy just is rage baiting for likes, and thanks to Roman for showing us what this blogger was publishing before that. And because now things are changing all the time, I don't even know what will happen tomorrow, so I just want to leave my opinion here. Whatever they decide, in 2 weeks, in 2 months, I still support Ukraine. It is a country that was invaded by an aggressor, Russia. I support the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine and its international borders, including Crimea. We don't know, maybe they will freeze this conflict like between the North and the South Korea. Maybe, I don't know, I think it's the most obvious outcome. But yeah, I was and will be on Ukraine's side. Also, I want to know the progress of censorship in Russia. At least somewhere they have progress. Recently they blocked YouTube. Now they banned calls via WhatsApp and Telegram. And I experienced this myself when I was going to talk to someone in Russia and they had to use VPN. So they literally isolate Russians from those who left, from their relatives and friends. But even within Russia, because it was very common and popular to use. But don't worry, because the government already created their new application, which is actually a copy of Telegram. And you can be sure that the big brother will carefully check all your messages to protect you from the dangerous extremist information. And they are literally forcing governmental institutions such as schools and so on to switch to this messenger instead. Also, in many regions, not only those bordering Ukraine, the authorities began to cut off internet connection for a night or for several days. Also, now they made searching for so-called extremist information illegal. It means that now Russians face a fine if they purposely search for extremist materials, including the information about the so-called international LGBT movement. So now it should look like this. The anti-corruption fund of Navalny, also some songs of Monetochka and Noise MC. And according to the law, the use of VPN while searching is an aggravating circumstance. And this all is very disheartening, but here I want to show you something that actually gives me hope. You know, there is a website, it's called W Place or World Place, where people can draw images by pixels. You can place only one pixel or one color droplet in 30 seconds. Your art might be destroyed or, as they say, grieved by others. I decided to paint an anti-war art on the place of my hometown. So I depicted a heart with Russian and Ukrainian flags, and on the Russian side I wrote "Russia will be free," and on Ukrainian one "Ukraina переможе." Actually, the first day, this inscription about Ukraine was covered by black dots. Someone wanted to destroy it. Then, on the second day, I noticed that someone supported my art. Firstly, they painted this peace sign. They wrote "За мир," which is for peace. Also, someone added these hearts. And yeah, maybe it looks childish and naive, like this is how I fight with this war, by pixels. Ее борьба. But still, this very fact that my picture was supported in my small hometown, even there are people, probably teenagers, and I was so glad to see it. So this was my take on the recent political events. I hope it was interesting for you, and if so, please like this video, write a comment and subscribe to my channel to support my channel. And also you can subscribe to me on Patreon or here in YouTube memberships. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good day. Goodbye. Пока-пока.